All right, this will be Q&A video number 23. Now, the first comment I want to address comes from a guy whose screen name is boxerfencer. I did a video in which I was talking about if you're doing a compound movement, if you take that set to failure, the reason you reach failure is not because any specific muscle involved in the lift is too locally exhausted or will have performed a maximal voluntary contraction, but rather the sum of the involved musculature no longer has the capacity to produce enough force to overcome the resistance. Now, I did say you can modify the way you do what you do in an attempt to locally exhaust the muscle when doing a compound movement so that it performs a maximal voluntary contraction, but you'd have to modify the range of motion, possibly slow it down a bit, and maybe even include some isometrics. But just because you can doesn't mean that you should. You always got to pick the right tool for the job. If the job is to locally exhaust the muscle so it performs a maximal voluntary contraction, I would argue more often than not an isolation exercise is going to be a better tool. So just because you can doesn't always mean that you should. Now, the next two comments come from a guy whose screen name is J. Kim, and the first comment indicates to me that he likely misunderstood something that I was talking about, because I was talking about why chin-ups are generally easier than pull-ups for most people, but his comment was, would this explain why the pull-up is a better lat builder? Now, I never said that. That's a bold claim and something that I did not say. I explained why one tool is generally easier to use than another tool, not that one tool is superior to another tool. Now, those 5 primary reasons why chin-ups are generally easier, I'm going to recap real quick, but I want you to understand that it doesn't mean that they are or they are not better than the other one. That's highly individual. It depends on the person who's doing it, their genetics, and their capacity to recruit. Now, those reasons are, number one, it puts the biggest, strongest muscle in a position to do the job that it does best. This is irrespective of whether or not you're using an overhand or an underhand grip. It just so happens that the underhand grip better promotes a pre-stretching of the biggest, strongest muscle so it can be recruited the most, prevents the biggest, strongest muscle from entering its shortest and weakest position, forcing it to work within the range in which it's strongest, creates a more stable joint that the biggest, strongest muscle passes through, and as a result cleans up the technical issues that are most commonly associated with an overhand grip, irrespective of how wide that grip is. So just because one tool is easier to use for most people doesn't mean that it's superior. That's highly individual, and I never said that the pull-up is a better lat builder. It might be for some people, it might not for others. Now, the next question has to do with rep speed. Let's say you got a heavy weight. Should you lift it with as much force as possible or less force but more control? Now, there's pros and cons to both. Force output determines how quickly the fast twitch fibers are recruited. The more early on in the set you can recruit them, the less work you need to do to fatigue them, and the more efficient you're going to become at recruiting them. The downside, if there was one, is that training that way with a high force output with a weight that is not maximal is not going to have as much carryover to near max efforts, because the high force output doesn't require you to sustain force output. So what happens is most people have good form when the weight is light. When the weight starts to get really heavy, form starts to deteriorate and you're forced to adopt a new strategy. If you want to increase your capacity to showcase your strength, you need to practice under the conditions which you're going to be performing. So the benefit to lifting with a lower force output but more sustained force output is it allows you to replicate the conditions under which a max lift would be performed. You can more effectively contract your muscles and tense your muscles against resistance, practice stability, which is a prerequisite to force production, and through stress and repetition, improve efficiency and body awareness. The downside, if there was one, is that when you lift with a lower force output than you could actually reduce your capacity to produce force. Also, if you're going to lift with a lower force output, you want to make up for that by tensing your muscles as hard as possible. But the downside to that is that you could accelerate the rate at which you create fatigue, and you might not be able to do as many reps, but you could make up for that with volume if you wanted to. So it's not, once again, that one is better than the other. You need to choose how you're going to do what you're going to do based on why you are doing it. Now, the last question comes from a guy whose screen name is Jerry Bruton. He's got a question about both heads of the biceps and active and passive insufficiency. Does it pertain to when you're doing your curls on an incline bench or a preacher bench? Now, the short answer is yes. Any muscle, not just the biceps, any muscle that crosses over more than one joint will always be subject to the laws of active and passive insufficiency, irrespective of the exercise of the tool that you are using. You like the information, share it. Click the fucking button at the bottom of the screen you're looking at. Subscribe to the channel. Support me, and I'm going to keep on bringing it.